Moderator, Mr. Earl Moxham. The United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands is General Secretary Reverend Norbert Stevens, Dr. Michelle Brown, virologist, Dr. Karen Lewis Bell, public health specialist, Dr. Ernestine Watson, pharmacist. Ladies and gentlemen who are participating in this or virtual advocacy forum, a warm welcome to all of you. In this our 80th anniversary as a congregation, it is with a great sense of responsibility that we, through the efforts of our advocacy committee, seek to maintain our duty to be a voice for our people, our members, adherents, and others from the wider community on an issue that affects all our lives and on which there is not always accessible information that is needed. This is what we're trying to facilitate this afternoon. A conversation around an issue that has the potential of not only impacting our health individually, but also our opportunities for familial, community, and social engagement, including even how we worship. The COVID-19 vaccine presents itself as a topic on which controversy is rife. And so it seemed to us as a church imperative to provide an occasion such as this that will allow for discussion and the sharing of informed insights as presented by our medical specialists, thereby allowing for you, our audience members, to have your questions asked and answered. As a church, we are especially pleased to have the participation of the United Church's General Secretary, the Reverend Norbert Stevens, who is not only a member and former minister of this congregation, but who is participating this afternoon as the voice of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, to which Webster belongs. Our medical specialists, who have kindly agreed to share in the evening's proceedings, will give their own perspectives as virologists, public health specialists, and pharmacists, so that we will be able to present and discuss the topic from all perspectives. In addition, we are especially thankful for the contribution as our moderator, the very talented and experienced Mr. Earl Moxham of the RJR Gleaner Communications Group. He specializes in radio and television features and documentaries for the media group and supervises the maintenance of Radio Jamaica's online news website. A son of the breadbasket parish of St. Elizabeth and an old boy of Monroe College, this husband of Winsome and father of 2 children has served the field of journalism for some 29 years. As special assignments editor, he is one mind that is frequently sought on major local and international political development and political history. He is the host of the weekly news review show That's a Wrap on Radio Jamaica 94 FM. Mr. Moxham, thank you for distinguishing our panel with your presence and guiding this evening's proceedings. It all remains for me then to express once more a warm welcome to you all and to express my own pleasure that you're here with us. I hope that you will not only find the evening informative, but that your unanswered questions and concerns will be addressed to your satisfaction. Let me end by asking God's blessings on this evening's proceedings. Let us pray. Living and loving God, in you we live and move and have our being. You are the source of all life. And so we come to you this afternoon, seeking your guidance and your grace as we discuss this very important matter that impacts health at so many levels. Guide our discourse, guide our thoughts. Be with us, we pray. Hallow this gathering with your presence. And may all that we say, think, and do redound to the glory and honor of your most holy name. We pray these things through Jesus Christ, our Lord and our Savior. Amen. God bless you all.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Carlisle, and hello and welcome to all of you joining us virtually. And this forum is being carried live by Facebook or on Facebook and YouTube. It's a special presentation of Webster Memorial United Church, and it will last 90 minutes. We have 4 presenters, and I will name them briefly and tell you just a little bit about what they do before I then ask each one to make the presentation, and at that point I'll say a little bit more about each presenter as she or he comes. So we are going to be starting with Dr. Michelle Brown. She's a virologist from the Department of Microbiology at the University of the West Indies, Mona. And she'll speak about COVID-19, its transmission, the clinical presentation, and the laboratory diagnosis. Dr. Karen Lewis-Bell is a public health specialist, and she will speak on the development of vaccines, how they present or how they prevent diseases, and their safety in the context of the available vaccines for COVID-19. She'll join us and make her presentation via Zoom. Dr. Ernestine Watson is a pharmacist, and she'll address the pharmaceutical perspective, including the dosage, immunization process, benefits, and possible adverse effects of the vaccine. And the Reverend Norbert Stevens, the General Secretary of the United Church of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, will address the responsibility of the church to inform its congregants about the vaccine. Very importantly, you may submit your questions for the panelists via Facebook and YouTube, and I'll put as many of them as possible to the appropriate person. Each presenter will have a maximum of 10 minutes to speak before we open the forum for your questions. Now, you must understand that I am accustomed to media time, so when we have 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes to make a presentation, then we have to stick to that as much as possible. And I'm sure that our presenters will want to hear from you and address your concerns. Without anything further to be said on the matter, therefore, I'm going to be inviting Dr. Michelle Brown to address you. Just to remind you, while she goes to the podium, she is a medical microbiologist and a medical doctor who is currently employed at the University of the West Indies. She has done extensive research on arboviruses in Jamaica, mainly dengue virus infection, the data from which have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Webster Memorial family, for having me here this afternoon. Now, very briefly, we'll be speaking about COVID-19 and its vaccine. So, as a preview, I'll be doing a brief review of the virus itself, SARS-CoV-2, and the disease it causes, COVID-19. Now, SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus, and it's on what we call an envelope virus. Its genetic material is RNA, and it is surrounded by the spikes on the outside. The spikes play a very important role in the disease process and also is a target of vaccines that have been developed and are being developed. Now, coronaviruses are not new to us. Outbreaks with coronaviruses are not new either. We have had outbreaks in the past, particularly in 2012. We had an outbreak of the Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS, that was responsible for 862 deaths. Also, in 2003, we had an outbreak that was caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS-CoV. Clinically, this was a respiratory illness, which was characterized by high fever, headache, body ache, atypical pneumonia, and mild respiratory symptoms. Overall, there was a 10% mortality rate. Now, in terms of these viruses, the coronaviruses, which affect both human and animals, they all seem to originate in bats. That is SARS-CoV-2, which is responsible for the present pandemic, MERS-CoV, which had the outbreak in 2012, and SARS-CoV, that was responsible for the outbreak in 2003. They all seem to have originated in bats. Now, COVID-19, as many of us will recall, this outbreak started in Wuhan, China in December 2019, where there were cases of pneumonia, the etiology agent of which was not known at the time. However, in January 2020, the etiological agent was identified as a novel coronavirus, and on February 21, the World Health Organization officially named it COVID-19. And as many of us will recall, On March 11, 2020, this outbreak was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. As I said before, SARS-CoV is caused by coronavirus and belongs to what we call the family, the group beta coronavirus. It is, its vector is transmitted mainly, it is thought to be transmitted via bats. Now, in recent times, we have heard of many variants. These variants have occurred in the UK, in Denmark, in Brazil, in South Africa. The literature states that these variant does not necessarily cause a higher transmission rate or more severe disease. But as you can appreciate, studies are ongoing and very soon information will change. And even here in Jamaica, we identify at least 4 cases of the variant forms of SARS-CoV-2. This was found in patients that traveled from the UK. Now, how is this virus transmitted? The virus is transmitted primarily by inhalation and by contact with infected droplets. And that is why it is so important for us to emphasize the need for wearing masks, for social distancing, and maintaining a distance at least 6 feet between persons, because the virus is easily transmitted in droplets from one person to the next, whether by sneezing, by coughing, or by talking. I'll also emphasize that the virus is able to live on surfaces for varying periods of time. So that is why we have to be very careful with our disinfecting our surfaces, with our hand sanitizing and hand washing to prevent the transmission of this very infective virus. Now, in particular, there are certain populations that has been identified in the literature as being at high risk for infection with SARS-CoV-2. These include persons above the age of 65, or diabetics, or persons who are hypertensive, persons with underlying respiratory infection. And this is so because the virus primarily infects the upper respiratory tract, the epithelium of the upper respiratory tract. It also affects persons who are immunocompromised, so are cancer patients, or patients with AIDS or HIV. They are more prone to infection, or elderly, person in golden age home, nursing homes, they are more prone to be infected and having severe form of this infection. Now, how does this illness or this disease manifest itself clinically? First of all, I'll mention that the incubation period takes from 2 to 14 days. That is, someone can become infected, and within that period of time, they can start to show symptoms. So that span of time varies from 2 to 14 days. Now, most cases are asymptomatic. So the person may be ill, but don't really feel ill. They might have a non-specific illness, similar to what they might have for influenza. So they might have a little lethargy, they might have a little headache, a low-grade fever, but not feeling very ill. However, the usual presentation is fever, a temperature of above 100.1 to 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. They might have a cough, a sore throat, and shortness of breath, which is very, very important because this disease or the virus primarily affects the respiratory tract. Now, majority of patients have mild symptoms. In fact, in the early days when we were hearing more about this disease, it was thought that up to 85% of patients were asymptomatic. And it was also thought that young people were able to bounce back from infection with this virus. However, in 20% of patients who become infected, the disease may be moderate to severe. Of this 20%, however, pneumonia, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and multiple organ failure may occur in 5% of patients. In fact, this virus, it affects all organs in the body. And some of the symptoms are loss of smell, loss of taste, because it affects the brain, the olfactory nerves, it affects the kidney, it affects the heart. So it is a multi-organ infection that is, or dysfunction that may result from severe infection with this virus. Now, how do we diagnose the virus in the lab? And this is very important because the symptoms may overlap with those of influenza and other respiratory infection. The only way we can definitively know that someone is infected with SARS-CoV-2 is by doing a laboratory test. Now, the gold standard is a polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that it is a RNA virus. That is a genetic material, it's RNA. So what we do in the lab essentially is try to detect the RNA in the patient's sample. And you might ask, what sample do we use? The main sample is a nasopharyngeal swab. So your doctor will take a swab, go to the nasopharynx, all the way to the back of the throat, go into the throat, put it in a transport media to keep the virus viable, send it to the lab. In the lab, we will do our polymerase chain reaction to detect the genetic material of the virus. And if it is positive, yes, that particular person is currently infected with the virus. Now, the PCR is the gold standard. Are there any methods of diagnosis in the lab for this virus? Yes, there is. We can detect antigen, which are proteins from the virus or parts of the virus. Now, the sample that we use for this test is also a nasopharyngeal swab. Now, the good thing about this test, unlike the polymerase chain reaction test, which may take an hour and a half, this test is a rapid diagnostic test. It is similar to a pregnancy test. So within 15 minutes to 30 minutes, we can have a result. So it is very handy for point-of-care testing or in rural areas where doctors don't have access to a virology lab that has a PCR machine. They can do a rapid antigen test. Within 15 minutes to half an hour, they can have the results. However, there's a little drawback to this test. This test might not be able to detect all positives. So some samples that are positives may give a negative result. So in some cases, when we get a negative antigen test, we may have to go on to do the polymerase chain reaction, which is the gold standard. We can also detect antibodies, which is an indication of our immune response to the virus. So when we become infected with a virus, our bodies develop what we call antibodies. So in the future, if we were to encounter that particular virus again, our bodies should protect us by us having antibodies against that virus. So we're able to detect antibody to this virus. There are two types of antibodies. There are IgM antibodies that comes up first during the infection, and then there are the IgG antibodies, which comes up later in the infection course. The IgG antibody tells us that we would have been infected in the past. So if a COVID patient has recovered and would like to know their immune status, they would do an antibody test. And in particular, IgG antibody, if that is positive, all it is saying is that that person had in fact been exposed to COVID, SARS-CoV. Now, briefly on treatment. Treatment is mainly supportive. So the patient has a fever, you give antipyretic, you encourage a patient to rest, you give a lot of fluid, you may give over-the-counter medication. Of note, do not give aspirin to children. Aspirin can cause what is known as Ray's disease. Now, in terms of sore throat, cough, we can use a room humidifier or a hot shower. And we have our little home remedies that we can use as well. In severe cases, the patient might need to be intubated and may need ICU support. And the good news is that we have a vaccine. And you'll hear more about this vaccine a little later on. However, I must advise us all, if your symptoms become severe to the point where you lose your sense of taste, your sense of smell, you can't breathe, you're gasping for breath, you have a cough, seek medical attention, get tested, and know your immune status. COVID is here, but there are things that we can do to protect ourselves and to protect others. Remember, social distancing, practicing good hygiene, hand hygiene, and wearing our masks. This will help to save our lives and save the lives of others. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Dr. Brown, Dr. Michelle Brown there, sticking very closely to the schedule. And we'll be hearing next from Dr. Karen Lewis-Bell. Dr. Lewis-Bell is a public health specialist who has more than 29 years' experience working in public health. She obtained the Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery degree in 1987 and the Master of Public Health in 1992 from the University of the West Indies. At the Ministry of Health, Dr. Lewis Bell successfully introduced new vaccines into the routine immunization schedule, conducted prevalence and cost-effectiveness studies justifying HPV vaccine introduction. Dr. Lewis Bell is currently with the Pan American Health Organization, World Health Organization, as a representative for Suriname. She has been there since January 2020. But it is important to note that she is participating today in her personal capacity at this forum. Dr. Lewis Bell now joins us via Zoom.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for having me. I would really like to thank Reverend Carlisle and the organizing team for inviting me to be a part of this forum, but more importantly, to be connected to my beloved Webster Church home. I am sharing my screen, and I hope that you can see it. Can someone please just indicate if you are able to see it?
Seeing it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've been asked to speak on what vaccines are and how they work, but I want to also speak a little bit about why. I want to first of all start by asking the audience, especially those under the age of 50, how many of you have ever seen an acute case of measles or polio, newborn tetanus, or whooping cough? I dare say that most of you would say you have never seen a case, or very few would have seen a case. And this is because of the success of vaccines in eliminating these diseases, and certainly in our part of the world. Vaccines have had a long history, over 200 years, starting with the first development and use of vaccine against smallpox in 1796. Following the success of reduction of illness and deaths from not only smallpox but yellow fever, in 1974, the World Health Organization developed the expanded program on immunization to improve the access to vaccines for all countries of the world, and in particular for children against these diseases that were causing significant illness and death. Diseases can also be eradicated through vaccination, and the first disease to be eradicated thus was smallpox in 1980. Vaccines are one of the most important public health achievements in history. It has significantly decreased many diseases, especially in children. It has caused a 99% reduction in polio cases. Consequently, polio is the next disease slated for eradication through vaccination. Vaccines are complex biological products designed to induce an effective and safe immune response. And the purpose is to induce protection from subsequent exposure to this disease without the harmful consequence of the infection itself. Now, why vaccination? Harmful germs are all around us, and they can invade the body, cause disease, and spread from person to person. Infectious diseases cause severe illness and often lead to death. They can cause outbreaks at various levels, and on the global level, this is called a pandemic. This affects millions of people, economies, international travel, and trade. And we know that the COVID-19 disease has already caused some 96 million cases and over 2 million deaths in over 236 countries, areas, and territories. Many infectious diseases can be prevented through vaccination. And when most people are protected by vaccination, the ability of the disease to spread is significantly reduced, and this is called herd immunity. And with herd immunity, it also indirectly protects those persons who cannot be vaccinated for various reasons, especially those who have a weakened immune system. Now, how does immunity work? Well, the part of a germ that causes the production of antibodies is called the antigen. And the antibodies are those proteins that our body's immune system develops to be able to recognize these specific antigens in the future. And so antibodies are specific for different antigens. And because of our exposure over the years, we have thousands of different antibodies in our system. Now, once the antibodies are produced, they work with the rest of the immune system to destroy the germ and stop the disease. And part of the immune response is the production of what is called memory cells. And these remain for a very long time, even after the germ is destroyed. So in the future, should the body be exposed to the same germ, then these memory cells will remember it as a foreign substance, and the immune system will respond immediately, but the production of antibodies will be much faster and more effective to protect against the disease. How do vaccines work? So vaccines work in a very similar way to the natural disease process. But the vaccine presents to the body the antigens or the specific components of the virus or bacteria for which the vaccine is working. And it presents it to the body so that the body can recognize it as a foreign substance, and the immune system can be triggered to produce antibodies. So in the future, should the body be exposed to this substance, it will be remembered, and the immune response will be much more rapid, and antibodies will be developed. So the vaccines contain weakened or inactive parts of the germ. And even with the newer vaccines that contain the blueprint for producing antigens rather than the antigen itself, they both work in a similar way. They do not cause disease in the person receiving the vaccine, but it prompts the body's own immune system to develop the antibodies. And this is in a similar way as it would if the body was exposed to the actual germ, but again, without the impact of having the disease or the consequence of the disease. There are different technology platforms for vaccine development. We're more familiar with some of the older platforms like inactivated bacteria or viruses. So these are the whole germs, but they are killed so that they do not cause disease. There is also live attenuated viruses that have been weakened, but they are used to stimulate the immune response. There are also virus-like particles, which are molecules that closely resemble the virus, but they are non-infectious because they do not contain any genetic material. In essence, they are like empty shells of the virus. And then there are various protein subunits of the pathogen or the germ that we want to elicit the response. Now, the less established and newer platforms in use are RNA, which is the nucleic acid, which is packaged within a vector. And there is also the DNA, which actually has more of the genetic code of the vaccine, of the organism. And then there is a viral vector, which are chemically weakened viruses that are used to transport the pathogen or the antigen that we want the vaccine to work against. Now, the various platforms have implications for how quickly vaccines can be developed, because for the vaccines that actually use the whole germ or the weakened form of the germ, like the virus, it takes a longer while because these organisms have to be developed in the lab. We have to get a sufficient quantity. The process of killing them or modifying them has to take place. It also has implications for how the vaccines can be stored, the number of doses that may be required, whether booster doses may be needed, etc., and also how the vaccines can be administered. Now, I know the concern really is about these mRNA vaccines, that it is thought that they may have been developed very quickly, and these are now the vaccines that have received approval and are largely used for COVID-19. So I'll just talk a little bit about these mRNA vaccines and how they work. So what it is that they have the nucleic acid coding for developing the protein. So this is really the blueprint for the spike protein. Dr. Brown spoke about the spike protein, which is on the actual surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And once the organism is identified and the particular part of the organism that triggers the infection by binding to our cells in the body, this is how we know which area we can target for vaccine development. And so the spike protein is what has been targeted for vaccine development for COVID-19. And so once this is introduced introduced in the body, it uses the body's cellular mechanisms to actually develop the spike protein itself. But this spike protein on its own is harmless. It is not an infectious substance, it's not causing disease, but it is just a segment on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that is what is actually used to bind to our cells to cause infection. And so the body will recognize this spike protein as a foreign substance, and it will trigger the immune response. And so antibodies will be developed, but without causing disease, of course. Now, the mRNA vaccines do not affect or interact with our DNA in any way, because these mRNA vaccines do not enter the nucleus of our cells where the DNA is found. The cells break down and get rid of the mRNA soon after it is finished using the instructions to make this protein. Now, although the mRNA vaccines are a relatively new technology, this has really been studied for quite some years now, well over 5 years, because they have been looking at it for the development of other vaccines. And beyond vaccines, cancer research has been using mRNA to trigger the immune system to target specific cancer cells. And because of how easily this technology can be developed in a very safe way, mRNA vaccines will most likely be the technology of future vaccines. Now, what are the steps in vaccine development? Now, once we have identified the antigen that is going to trigger the immune response, then we can identify what should be the target for the vaccines. And for COVID-19, as I said, this is the spike protein. Now, vaccines are developed in different stages. We first have the preclinical stage where the vaccine is developed in the laboratory. And then we have the clinical phases where we now test the vaccine in humans. In the preclinical phase, studies are done in animals or in cell or tissue culture to find out whether the vaccine, once developed, actually does mount the immune response that we need in terms of developing the antibodies. And in the preclinical studies, it also looks at the safety of the vaccine at the cellular level. Once that information has been gathered and it is found that the safety is okay and that the immune response we desire is okay, then we move into clinical trials. And there are different stages looking at different using the vaccine in different numbers of persons. And the clinical trials are primarily to test the immune response. That is the development of the antibodies, the safety of the vaccine, as well as the efficacy to determine whether the vaccine does what we want it to do. In phase 1 trials, less than 100 persons received the vaccines. In phase 2 trials, about 200 to 500 persons received the vaccines. And these are persons who have the characteristics similar to those for whom the vaccine is intended. And this is the age group, the physical health of the individuals, and other subpopulations, also different ethnic groups. And in addition to studying safety and immune response, phase 2 trials also look at the dosing. What is the quantity of dose of vaccine that needs to be given? How many doses? Is it 1 or 2? What is the frequency of giving the doses? How do you space them? And what is the route of administration? Once the phase 2 trials have provided sufficient information, then we move on to phase 3 clinical trials where the vaccine is given to thousands of people. And usually it's tens of thousands of people, oftentimes in several countries. And not only is safety monitored, but also the efficacy. And important to note is that these clinical trials usually take place over a period of time, a minimum of about 2 months. And the reason for that is that short-term side effects usually occur within hours to a few days of having received the vaccines. And then the longer term effects of the vaccines would take about 30 to 45 days. So typically, a minimum of about 2 months are needed to provide sufficient safety data. And then for efficacy, there are different endpoints of the efficacy. One can look at infection. And this again would require you testing the individual to see if they have actually been infected by the virus. We can also look at clinical disease and severe clinical disease. And one of the other efficacy endpoints can also look at death. And so depending on the prevalence of the disease in the population, that is how much disease is circulating in the population, the phase 3 clinical trial can take a very short time, as it did with the COVID-19 vaccines, because there were so many diseases out there, so many incidents of disease, that we were able to detect clinical disease very quickly. It is also important to note that the phase 3 clinical trials are usually what is called double-blinded randomized controlled trials. So what that means is neither the investigators nor the recipients themselves know who will be receiving vaccines and who will be receiving a placebo, because there are two groups: a group that receives the vaccine and a control group that receives a placebo, which could be another vaccine or just plain normal saline or some other inert substance. Because we want to be able to compare those who received the vaccine with those who did not receive the vaccine to determine the safety and the efficacy. Once the sufficient information on safety and efficacy is received, and then it is presented to independent regulatory authorities for approval and licensing for use, for wider use in the general population. These independent regulatory authorities have nothing to do with the manufacturing of the vaccine. And importantly, the vaccine has to be licensed for use in the country in which it was manufactured also. Now, once the vaccine is now made available for use in the general population, continued monitoring is done to look at the safety of the vaccine, any possible adverse events, and the overall effectiveness of the vaccine to see how it really works in the real world. Now, finally, I've borrowed this slide from the WHO to really explain how the development of the COVID-19 vaccines took place. Typically, vaccines take about 10 years to develop. And the reason for that is that the different stages are done sequentially, one after the other. And oftentimes there are gaps in the different phases while the investigators are trying to seek additional funding and political commitment. In addition to that, once the phase 3 trials are completed, that is when manufacturers will now build out their infrastructure to scale up production of the vaccine. Additionally, the phase 3 trial could take quite a while, depending on the incidence of disease or the number of cases of the disease that is circulating, for them to determine what the endpoint of the vaccine efficacy is like. Specifically now for COVID-19, this was accelerated because all the different phases of vaccine development were done in parallel. And in addition to that, because there was such concern about this disease, there was strong financial and political commitment, and manufacturers also advanced the process of building out their infrastructure to produce vaccines at scale in a very rapid way. The technology that has been used for the mRNA vaccines takes a very short time, because they did not have to now grow viruses in the lab, get a certain quantity of virus. It was really done fairly quickly. But it's important to note that these vaccines were developed in an accelerated manner, but without compromising the scientific rigor or the safety. And while vaccines are now being used, because this is a disease of public health concern and of international concern, it is important that the safety data and the efficacy data has identified that the benefits of this vaccine far outweigh any risk in terms of the possible side effects that have been identified. And so this is why countries have received emergency use authorization to deliver these vaccines to individuals, while ongoing investigations and information is being gathered in the phase 4 trial, what is called the post-marketing surveillance, as we continue to get more information about effectiveness and safety. So in summary, I really want to say that vaccines are developed in a very safe manner without compromising the science or safety issues.
Vaccines will only come on the market once we are ensured that they are efficacious, they do what we say we want them to do, and the safety profile of the vaccines are good. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much as well, Dr. Karen Bell, Lewis Bell. And just to remind you, our virtual audience, that you may continue to submit your questions via Facebook and YouTube. We will be following up with our presenters towards the end of this forum. So you'll get some of your questions answered. I suspect some of the questions in your mind are being answered even as you hear some of the presentations, but I suspect also that there'll be more that you will want to have answered. So now we move on to Dr. Ernestine Watson. Dr. Watson is a graduate of the College of Arts, Science and Technology CAST, which kind of dates you, Dr. Watson. But then she went on as well to the successor institution, the University of Technology, UTech, Jamaica, where she gained a Bachelor of Pharmacy, and the University of Florida, where she gained a Doctor of Pharmacy. She is the General Manager of Everybody's Pharmacy and a part-time lecturer at the University of Technology and the University of the West Indies. She is, as well, the immediate past president of the Pharmaceutical Society of Jamaica. Dr. Watson.
Thank you very much. And I wish to express my thanks to the Webster Memorial family for having me. Now, this evening, I think I get to do the hot topic, which is on everybody's minds. But just as a way of introduction, I'd like to just take us back. I know it was mentioned, but I'd like to take us back to times when we had health crises. And we looked at the polio, but there's also what happened before we had the simple thing of antibiotics. Now, in the 1940s, if you got a cut or a scratch, you could have developed sepsis and died. And it seems like hospitals were full of people with blood poisoning contracted from a cut or a scratch. And doctors could do little for them but wait and hope. That existed then, before the discovery of the antibiotic, which we take for granted now. As pharmacists, we frequently have to be telling patients, you don't use an antibiotic unless you have to. Then, of course, we heard about the polio, but this gentleman, Paul Alexander, who was one of the 74 persons who were actually involved in the polio. He had contracted polio, and he is alive today. He's 74 years old. And are you seeing my slides? Oh. Just a minute.
Perhaps you can continue speaking while you get some technical support there.
Yes. So he, at age 74, he is alive today, and he is one of the persons who have the fear now that he may contract the COVID-19. And in those days, again, we had situations where persons were saying there were sick children everywhere and nowhere, no one to help them. So the situation then, before the COVID, before the polio vaccine existed, is similar to what we see today. What's different about the development of the COVID-19 vaccine? Well, we have heard from Drs. Bell and Brown, sorry, that the mind went there for a while, that the COVID-19 vaccine is not new, right? Not totally new. The coronavirus, there has been work on it before. Groundwork was laid from two streams, the NIH and other University of Pennsylvania. But in addition, the vaccine has been accelerated because of the amount of funding and the advanced use of technology. So that facilitated the speed at which the vaccine has been developed. And we did hear how vaccines work, and the mRNA vaccine, which is currently the one that is projected to be the standard for the vaccine, for use of vaccine. What is special about this is that the vaccine, the messenger RNA, also causes an inflammatory response. And to get the vaccine to the site, it is enclosed in lipids. Now, some of the lipids we see here, 5-hydroxybutyl, polyethylene glycol, and we can pay attention to that one in particular. The phosphocholine and other cholesterol, they enclose the messenger RNA to be injected into the host, into the individual. There are other ingredients, your potassium chloride, monobasic potassium phosphate, sodium chloride, and sucrose. So these are the main ingredients outside of the mRNA, which is included in your vaccine. Now, let us talk about some things that are not included in this vaccine. The vaccine doesn't have aluminum, mercury, or other food allergens. Now, why should I pay attention to that? Most of the allergic responses and most of the bad reports we have had from persons who are taking the vaccine comes from these three: the aluminum, the mercury, and the food allergens, which is not in the COVID-19 vaccine. Let's look at a comparison. The three main ones are the AstraZeneca, the Moderna, and the Pfizer vaccines. And when we look, we see, let's look at efficacy. The vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer range has about a 95% efficacy. The Oxford AstraZeneca ranges from 62 to 90% efficacy. And your Sputnik, about 92%. Now, the RNA vaccines are your Moderna and your Pfizer. How will we get the vaccine to be distributed and how it's stored is also significant outside of the efficacy, because getting the vaccine into the population is very important. So the Moderna requires a temperature for storage of minus 20 degrees centigrade, and the biotech minus 70 degrees. Now, we can imagine that for countries who do not have the refrigeration and the ability to transport these highly sensitive vaccines, it is going to be a problem. So the Oxford AstraZeneca has a benefit in terms of the distribution and the cost to distribute, although the efficacy is not as high as your Moderna and your Pfizer. All require 2 doses. 1 dose is given, and the individual, after having gotten that first dose, must continue to take the precautions because the body is just developing the response to the vaccine. When we look at cost, the most expensive is your Moderna. And again, we can imagine that because we have the issue of transportation, refrigeration, that will make a difference. So the Moderna is 25 US or 33 pounds, rather the other way, 25 pounds or 33 US. The Pfizer is 15, and your AstraZeneca, the Oxford AstraZeneca, that one comes out most cost effective at 3 pounds or $4 US. A lot of the issues that we have with the persons who would wish to take the vaccine or who have doubts about the vaccine are the side effects. The studies have shown that, like any medication, any drug, I will go back to the antibiotics. Antibiotics, which we are so accustomed to, some persons will take a penicillin and go into a major reaction, have adverse reactions. So all drugs have side effects. Some of the side effects are good effects or wanted effects. So for example, for the younger people, though you will hear them coming to ask for certain types of pills to increase the appetite because they want to get, the Coca-Cola body, right? And that is actually the side effect of an antihistamine drug, which is used to prevent allergies. So some side effects are wanted. Some side effects are bad, but manageable. So the side effects which are manageable when you take the vaccine include injection site pain, flu-like symptoms, fever, fatigue, headaches, and muscle pain. And why do we have these? It's the body's response to this foreign substance, right? There is an issue with patients who contract the COVID-19. It is sometimes called a storm-like reaction. What happens is that the body over-responds to the antigen. And then instead of having just fever and headaches, we get severe tightening of the chest, tightening of the throat, sweating, etc. Those are some of the, and in medical terms, it is called the COVID storm. Now, all of the vaccines seem to have the similar side effects reported thus far. What we have to be careful about is the adverse reactions and complications that may appear with the vaccines. What are these? We have the anaphylactic reactions, or sometimes we call it septic shock. And the other one is the Bell's palsy. And if you go on the internet or any one of those WhatsApp messages that are being passed around, we will realize that some persons have had severe allergy-like reactions. For the Pfizer and the BioNTech, it was reported that 8 people who received the vaccine within the first 2 weeks, they actually had severe reactions. And remember I said to you that the vaccine is enclosed in some lipid-like substances in order to get into the cell. Now, the polyethylene glycol, which is one of the lipids, it is suspected that this might be the lipid that may be causing that excessive adverse reaction. However, when we consider the number of persons who have gotten the vaccine and did not have that type of reaction, we have to weigh the risk and the benefit. If previously you have had incidents of severe reactions to any type of drug, and especially severe reactions to polyethylene glycol, then you need to tell your physician or whoever will be giving you that vaccine. Remember, some persons wear an armband because they have allergies. They have food allergies. They have different types of allergies. Before you do a surgery, you have to answer a list of questions because some of the things that may be used in anesthesia can cause an anaphylactic reaction. So it is something that we have to be careful and be aware of. So an anaphylactic reaction is a severe response of the body to an antigen, and in this case, to the vaccine. As of December 19, there were 6 cases of an anaphylactic reaction among 272,000 persons who had received the COVID-19 vaccine. In the United Kingdom, 1 was recorded. The other thing that we hear about is that persons have said that their face became twisted after having had the vaccine. This is called Bell's palsy. It's the facial nerve that is inflamed and becomes swollen. So there is a weakness and drooping which occurs usually on one side of the face. This is usually temporary. But when it occurs, it is very frightening, and so patients who may have had that experience will respond in a way that may be make the situation very bad for them if they are not aware. Now, there were 7 cases of Bell's palsy were reported for Pfizer and the Moderna trials. The frequency of these cases they're actually no greater than the frequency of Bell's palsy in the general population. So other drugs that persons may take will cause this same type of reaction. In the US, there's about 0.01% chance of Bell's palsy actually occurring. Now, who gets the vaccine? The World Health and governments, they are prioritizing, and the usual priority, it will be healthcare workers and essential workers, older people, persons with chronic diseases. They are the ones who are recommended to take the vaccine. And what this slide shows us is that when we look at the amount of doses administered per 100 persons, Israel, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Britain, US, they are at the top, right? Places like Mexico, Argentina, 0.1% of the population. And as you know, the only country that I can recall reported in the Caribbean so far is Cayman Island, who have actually gotten their citizens the vaccine. So it is very important that when we look at the vaccination, that we consider all of the pros and cons, the risk, do your risk analysis, and recognize that the vaccine, like any other drug, and as a pharmacist, I can tell you, we see all kinds of reactions, adverse reactions to drugs, and there is a system for reporting these reactions, even after the drug has been on the market for many years. If the reactions start coming up, there is a reporting form at the Ministry of Health and Wellness. You fill in the information, the doctors, whoever, and that is sent back to the manufacturers to ensure that continuous monitoring occurs. So, carefully consider the evidence from reputable sources. There are many. World Health Organization, PAHO, the NIAID, Food and Drugs, and the European Food and Drugs, Australia, New Zealand. You can do your research. Study and compare the history of pandemics and other world health crises. This is not our first health crisis, and unfortunately, it is not going to be our last. Know your health status and your risk, because every individual will respond differently. And finally, pray about your final decision. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dr. Watson. And it's time now to turn to the Reverend Norbert Stevens. And he comes in at the right moment, as Dr. Watson advises that you should also engage in prayer. Reverend Stevens received his theological education at the United Theological College of the West Indies and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in theology, a diploma in ministerial studies in 1988. He holds an MBA from the University of the West Indies, Mona School of Business, and was ordained to the ministry of the Word and Sacraments in 1989 within the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. He has been the General Secretary of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands since January 2011. Reverend Stevens.
Thank you, moderator, who hails from my parish, but obviously from the lighter side. Distinguished fellow panelists, members of the physical and virtual audience, good howdy do. Without doubt, this panel discussion offers one model of response from the church in facilitating awareness and responsible information in the context of low trust. Such a conversation as we're having today offers a space for listening to those who have a trust deficit on a number of fronts, but also offers an opportunity for learning in the hope that the overall health of a nation might be safeguarded. So our congratulations to the leaders and organizers of the Webster Memorial Congregation. It must also be said that the organization called the Church does not come to this conversation as an innocent, interested party. Recall, and sadly so, it was the church in a number of countries that facilitated the spread of the disease. In South Korea, nearly 5,000 confirmed cases were linked to a church which initially defied the state regulation for closure. In Malaysia, where 313 persons tested positive after attending a religious gathering, pushing that country into lockdown. And lest we forget, our first case here in Jamaica was linked to a religious service. Recall also the aggressive push by some churches in Jamaica to ensure that in the midst of COVID, it should be business as usual. However we view our responsibility as church, we ought to come to this conversation from a position which acknowledges with humility that we have not always been agents of health and hope. Maybe if we're honest, we have not during these times done much to reduce the trust deficit. And yet among our many roles, a source of health and hope are precisely the required role in society at this time of low trust. So I wish for us to examine briefly the issue of trust. To my mind, there are a number of factors at play. Firstly, the source of information. For many people, it is social media. It is not far-fetched to state that social media is both a blessing and possibly a curse. It keeps us connected, but it certainly is a source for the spreading of disinformation. And then there is history. Many have pointed to the misuse of vaccines among minority groups, mainly people of color, in parts of the world by state agents which are well documented. And then there is a science, which we have heard much of today. Many have made the claim that the approved vaccines were developed far too quickly and have not been rigorously tested as previous vaccines. Videos from people, including medical practitioners, warning against people accepting the vaccines can be found circulating on social media in all shapes, sizes, and forms. And then there is truth. Maybe this is a larger issue. All one has to do to undermine truth is to offer an alternative truth, or simply raise issues of source and or motive. And then there is financial gain. Big government and large corporations stand to make millions from selling and distributing the vaccines. We are already seeing the geopolitics in terms of which parts of the world will have the capacity to purchase sufficient quantities of the vaccine and which will not even have access to those sources. Dr. Watson spoke about Cayman, which is part of this United Church. 9,000 doses of the vaccines were already received in January with another set in February. We're not receiving anything before the mid part of this year. And they are receiving it because of their connection with Britain. In specific terms, people are uncertain. They hear of persons negatively reacting to the vaccines and wonder if it is worth the risk. They are fearful, sometimes caused by varied theological interpretations by religious organizations about end times linked to the virus. For some, the vaccine is a mark of the beast, so one should not take it. Or that, as we've heard debunked today, but still held by some, it will change one's DNA. We've already heard church leaders in this society who have articulated what their members should do in relation to accepting the vaccine, and trust me, they're not all on the same side of the fence. From the perspective of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, taking a vaccine is basically a personal choice and should be treated as such. Yes, we have a role to offer clear guidelines for moral and ethical choices, but this is not one such. Our role cannot be one of dictation, but rather one of providing all the necessary information for people to make responsible choices. I therefore propose the following as a pathway to offering health and hope in the midst of mistrust. First thing we need to do is to listen. As we're doing today, let us create other spaces where people can share their concerns, their fears, their discomfort, and their questions about their faith. The fact that people have questions and concerns do not render them foolish or that their concerns should be dismissed. We know that we've always had vaccines and that they are basically safe. And yes, when we were small, when we took our children to the clinic to be vaccinated, we got medication to take home because we knew the child would become sick as well. And yes, these are unprecedented times, but we must listen. Secondly, we need to provide as much as we can, reliable and responsible information to our members, adherents, and the wider society. And this requires partnerships with state and other agencies in obtaining and sharing relevant and credible information. And thirdly, we need to journey with people. We need to continue to do this. We must work towards having a cadre of competent people to provide a ministry in this area, of which the vaccine issue is but one part. The church is already very much at the forefront of offering social services at all levels. So the interventions that we continue to do, the prayers, the provisions, the advocacy, the counseling, the empowerment, must continue as we walk alongside people to ensure a healthy and prosperous nation. I offer this closing quote from Jesus in John's Gospel 10, verse 10, which undergirds the response of the church in life and death issues. Jesus said, "I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." Let us continue to talk.
Thank you very much, Reverend Stevens. Important note on which to end this round of presentations in this very important forum. It's time now to hear from you, our viewers and listeners, and in terms of some of the questions that have arisen from your participation in the forum. Some of those might have been answered already based on the presentations, but there are some others I suspect that even the presentations might have given rise to. I would love to get confirmation that that our panelist joining us via Zoom is still with us so that she can participate in this segment. But I'm going to put out the first question, and I don't know if maybe Dr. Brown, if we can start with you on this one, and then we can see whether someone else can also participate in this. This question is, if the COVID-19 is mutating and the vaccine is not able to protect against the mutated strain, what is the point in taking it? I'm not sure that anybody has said that the vaccines developed thus far are not able to contend with the new variants, but I think you can clarify that.
That's true. So far, from what I've read, the vaccine can, in fact, be used for the variants. You would want to support. That's what I have read so far.
Yes, there is no information that it cannot be used, but I would like to raise another point. The fact that the influenza vaccine has to be modified on an annual basis because of the rapidity with which the flu virus mutates. So we have to always compare the risk versus the benefits. And at the rate at which persons with morbidities and the elderly are having increased mortality with this virus, and the effect it is having on populations, children can't go to school, Parents are afraid to send, this for the past 2 weeks or so, I know many parents have had a lot of concerns. And the financial impact, it's increasing poverty, especially in the areas where poverty is high. So we have to weigh the risk versus the benefits and make decisions, wise decisions.
All right. Dr. Karen Lewis Bell is still with us. So, Dr. Lewis
Yes,
Bell,
I am.
yes, can you
Yes,
join in on this particular question?
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Just to say that the evidence thus far indicates that the vaccine is still effective against the variants. Some small studies were done in the UK looking at the antibodies that were developed using the vaccine in individuals to see if they would neutralize the virus in a laboratory setting. And it was found that the new variants were still neutralized with the antibodies. However, and this is so because the spike protein, although it is specific segments of the spike proteins that the
All right. Let's hope that Dr. Lewis Bell can be reconnected. You're back with us?
Yes. The section with the variants did not affect the vaccine. And if it is that the variants continue to change, the method of developing the vaccine can be easily adjusted to produce vaccines that will still work against new variants.
All right. Here's a very fundamental question, which is this. Is there anyone who should not take the vaccine? Who wants to start with that one? Dr. Watson?
Okay, so right now there have been a slight adjustment for persons who are very elderly. They have noticed that those persons have had increased adverse events and increased, in some cases, mortality. So those persons, they have now added that these patients should be carefully counseled before they take the vaccine. Also, I mentioned in my slides that persons who have had previous reactions to the PEG, polyethylene glycol, then if you should not take it because it is a component of the COVID-19 vaccine. So if you have any allergies, any previous allergic responses, especially if there is a severe anaphylactic type reaction, then those persons should not take the vaccine.
On that note, what is the most serious side effect so far from using the vaccine? That's another question that has come in. Apart from death, obviously.
Well, the most serious one has been related to the anaphylaxis. So the patient may go into any of the conditions resulting from anaphylaxis. They may go into shock, they may have severe seizures, they may have a heart failure. Any of those things may occur. We did mention the Bell's palsy, but then that is usually reversible.
Right. Dr. Brown, is there any perhaps inadvertent advantage to a country as disadvantaged as Jamaica in respect of being perhaps a little bit down in the queue to get the vaccine? Could it be that some of the pitfalls would have been avoided by the time we got it? Is that something to hang our hat on at all?
Maybe to a lesser extent. But the truth is, because it affects our social life, the economics, the longer we wait, the further we are in the queue, we will so be at a disadvantage, really, in terms of persons being sick away from school, the economics of it, as opposed to us hanging our hat and, waiting otherwise. So I think we're more at a disadvantage from being all the way down in the queue.
And on that question, Reverend Stevens, in respect of the justice issue in terms of the dispossessed of the world, so to speak, and not being able to have access to those things which the wealth of the world provide or allows us to participate in. And you mentioned the Cayman Islands, and one can't help but perhaps think about the irony of history in that it is those countries that sought to throw off, at least to a certain extent, the yoke of colonialism that are still continue to suffer the consequences of the underdevelopment arising from that said process of colonialism or colonization.
Well, Earl, you just have to go to Haiti.
Yes.
One of the first republics, if you like, in the Western Hemisphere, and the condition of their social fabric. I think that is a struggle we face, that we attempted in the midst of COVID to shut down, but couldn't do it totally because of the economics. And we're suffering as a consequence of that. And we're still at the back of the line for the vaccine. And maybe these medical persons can tell us if we're actually getting any of those vaccines. I'm not even sure if those are the vaccines we're going to get. So that part of the role of the church is how we become advocates for the justice issue. Because again, in Cayman, those vaccines are free. I am not sure what will happen when it gets to Jamaica, given the social structure that we have as a country.
Dr. Brown, you...
Well, what I was going to say, I've seen a publication which indicated that by April, we should be getting the vaccine, and it listed a number of frontline workers who will be in line to get the vaccine. So we'll wait and see what happens.
But which of the vaccines? Has that been ascertained yet?
Well, I'm not sure exactly which one.
Dr. Lewis Bell, can you answer that in terms of which of the vaccines are we likely to get?
Okay, so I cannot speak for Jamaica, but what I can say is that Jamaica is a participant in the COVAX facility, which is a facility that has been established by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a coalition for epidemic preparedness initiatives, and the WHO to ensure that all countries have equitable access to vaccines. And Jamaica is a participant in the COVAX facility. The Pfizer vaccine is one of the first vaccines that the COVAX facility will try to make available to countries, and they are also working on the AstraZeneca. So they are negotiating with several manufacturers to have different options. There are about 8 to 10 different options of possible vaccines. Some are in different stages of development. And it is expected that all countries will benefit from vaccination either through bilateral agreements, which all countries can make arrangements for, or through the COVAX facility, of which many Caribbean countries are participating in. The expectation is that by early April, countries should receive vaccines.
Let me drill down a little bit more and mention 3 possible sources, because I think they have been mentioned by the government of Jamaica. The one being developed in Cuba, possibly one from India, possibly China. Are these would these be covered by the COVAX facility?
Yes, so the COVAX facility has already signed agreements or memoranda of understanding with a number of companies, and some of those vaccines that you mentioned are part of the agreements, but they may not necessarily be available immediately, and they have to ensure that they do receive emergency use listing from stringent regulatory authorities and or emergency use authorization as well.
Dr. Watson, have you been paying attention to those other vaccines?
Oh, yes. One of those is the Sputnik, which is...
Russian?
I think it is German. And then there is a few...
It's the Russian vaccine.
Russian, okay, right. And there is also one coming from India. So the government has said that they will explore all possible sources for us to be able to fulfill the need within the Jamaican public. And the CMO, I listened to her last week, and she did mention that there was an increased expectation for the numbers of persons who will be vaccinated on the first round in April. So we are looking at a little bit more than was expected when it was first spoken.
Yes. Dr. Brown, in terms of as quickly as possible safeguarding your population in terms of the percentage of the population that needs to be vaccinated, what should be the sort of threshold figure that we should be looking at?
I would ideally say over 50%, 50% or more, to get an adequate protection. And in terms of herd immunity, I would say at least 50%. That's my opinion. Because the more persons that are protected will protect others against it by the principle of herd immunity. So we should aim as high as possible. So I'd say at least 50% if that's possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Reverend Stevens, I have somebody is sending what the person says is a theological question. And the question is, how should the church respond to being required to take the vaccine to live and move in and around the world? It says France, and I haven't confirmed this, but France is already considering vaccine visas so that tourists can visit their country and so that people can move around. It will then become a requirement and not an option.
I think the church has always attempted as best as it can in the context of justice and right to obey legislative authorities or state authorities. But I fundamentally believe a vaccine is a personal choice. And I don't know that any church can insist that a person takes a vaccine. The state can, but I don't think the church should be doing that.
But the church has stood up against the state on some fundamental issues from time to time. So I suspect the person would want to press and ask the question, should the government of Jamaica legislate that everybody should take the vaccine? What then? I know that there are certain persons of a particular faith throughout the world and here in Jamaica whose faith tells them that they should not take blood, for example. They should not take blood transfusions, even to their own detriment.
Right. Well, I firmly believe that the vaccine is safe. That's my personal view, and I think that there are a majority of members of the United Church who would feel that way. So if it is in the best interest of the nation, it is built on science, because science is a complement to faith. If it is proven to be effective, then we would have no issue at all recommending our members to take it.
Dr. Lewis Bell, there's another question asked on behalf of those persons. The person says, is there any study of how the virus affects sicklers?
So the initial studies that were done in the phase 3 clinical trials did not specifically target some specific subgroups such as sicklers, but continuing studies are being done. And as the vaccine is being rolled out in the general public, we should be able to get additional information on specific subgroups such as pregnant women, and they are going to be doing studies on children, because for now the vaccine is not licensed for use in children under the age of 16. So there are different subgroups that they will gather additional information on as the vaccine is rolled out. But if you would allow me, I would just like to clarify a couple points.
Yes.
Certainly, when we look at possible side effects, this has to be reported in every single vaccine recipient. This does not mean that the vaccine itself caused these side effects, because what we have to look at is the general rate of these side effects in the general population. And we also, as part of the studies, had to look at comparing those who received the vaccine and those who received placebo. What was the rate of these side effects? And there were very similar rates in both groups. With any vaccination, any possible side effects could be caused from a number of things. It could be coincidental. It could be due to operational aspects of the vaccination program. It could have been the wrong dose of vaccine that was given. The cold chain was not maintained. It was given in the wrong site. A number of things. And it could also be due to inherent properties of the vaccine. So persons could have allergic reactions to a component of the vaccine. What it does require is that every side effect should be notified so that it can be properly investigated to determine if there is any true association or causation from the vaccine. With respect to herd immunity, for most vaccines, it requires a very high rate, usually about 90 to 95%. We are not sure yet because we still don't have all the information, but the expectation is that for the COVID-19 vaccine, it is going to require about 80% of the population, somewhere around 80% of the population to be vaccinated for us to get herd immunity.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brown, there is the question as to whether, in the Jamaican context, how the disease is affecting aspects of our daily lives, such as, for example, the education of our students and their attendance or non-attendance, that is something that we are still making it up as we go along. Is there really a template for how we proceed in terms of our educational system?
Well, I think for the most part, the Ministry of Education is working along with the Ministry of Health to see how best, for example, they can have face-to-face teaching, face-to-face learning happening now. So I think that is the way forward. The education system has to depend on the Ministry of Health, because students at home, many students are at a disadvantage, being at home, not having the Wi-Fi, not having the facility to learn, do online teaching effectively, online learning. And there's a risk of students being out and not practicing the safety precautionary measures and being at risk for infection. So I think the Ministry of Education has to work along with the Ministry of Health to see how best a compromise or a situation can be reached where children are in fact learning. So I think that is where we're at now.
Yeah. And Dr. Watson, in respect of the possible mental health impact of this very special period, I don't know whether your society, your group of professionals are seeing an increase, for example, in prescriptions in response to the need to assist people in handling the pressure, the mental health pressure of this pandemic.
Yeah, yes, definitely. As a matter of fact, the Pharmaceutical Society of Jamaica is about to launch a series of wellness seminars where we try to, via Zoom, engage persons in activities that would cause what we say de-stressors. So meditation, exercise, other social interventions. Within the pharmacy environment, a lot of the community pharmacies are having programs where we try to reach out to our elderly patients especially. Because for a lot of our elderly patients, coming to the pharmacy is an outing. They come, and of course, they know us, we know them, we interact with them not just on a level of medications, but their whole lifestyle. How are you doing? We try to remember things that happen to them, keep abreast with things that are happening outside of their medication. And that loss of interaction is affecting them. So we have other ways. We set up lines that we call them and try to allow them to come to the pharmacy, but we engage them in a particular way. So when they come, they don't wait. They have a set time to come. Some pharmacies have a special hour or so that they open a little bit earlier so that the elderly patients can come in and just form different ways of, they are the ones who are mostly affected, the elderly patients. And of course, the children. We see it in the behavior of our children. So children are acting up, and of course, parents are thinking that the children are hyperactive or other, conditions, but it's just the loss of interaction with their peers. I can tell you, my own granddaughter, for the first week when she had to do the Zoom classes, when she heard she was going to school, she was so excited, and she got into her uniform and everything. And then when she came and she sat down in front of the iPad, she said, "Where are my friends? This is not school." And her face was sad for the entire day.
Yes.
And a lot of parents are saying that. The children and the very elderly, they are the ones affected. And so as a society, I like what the Ministry of Health is doing in that they have these rangers where they send out and interact in, of course, socially distancing way. As a church, we have invited our children back into the service. And I think that's a big deal, because at least it's a controlled environment, and they do get some form of interaction. So it's a big thing.
All right, and I'm going to give the final words to Reverend Stevens, and I'm going to prompt you a little bit further. I know you already have your thoughts on the matter, but should there be a sort of united response beyond the individual church body, the individual denomination, so that there can be perhaps one of those special occasions on which one of those special events that cause all the churches in Jamaica to come together to seek to minister in ways more than the norm to the people who are suffering during this particular crisis?
Since COVID started, we have had a COVID response team, and early in the piece, we recognized that people are having mental health issues. But Jamaicans are proud people. They don't like to admit it. And therefore, we've seen it with the elderly, those, for instance, who, as Ernestine has said, used to come to church and can't come anymore because they are 65 and over. The parents, we talk about the children, but the parents who have had to be teachers at home are stressed. Those who have lost their jobs, those who have been demoted because of lack of pay. There's a whole raft of people in our society who are suffering. Our response has been to establish some counseling centers, and both here in Jamaica and in Cayman, as a response to this. But I take your point that we are part of an ecumenical body, and this is an opportunity for us as churches to stop competing with each other and to come together and allow the resources that we have collectively to respond to an issue in our society that we are afraid to raise and talk about. It is a frightening thing, because we have had partnerships with the Ministry of Health in organizing some centers for mental health issues, but it is difficult to sustain because people just don't like the idea of being told that something is wrong with them mentally. They think it is a disease. And I agree with you that we need to find ways, as we're doing today, to broaden the conversation so that others can become beneficiaries of the resources that the church has.
All right, thank you so much, Reverend Stevens. And this is where we have to bring things to a close as far as the discussion is concerned. You heard it there from Reverend Norbert Stevens, Dr. Ernestine Watson, Dr. Karen Lewis Bell, and Dr. Michelle Brown. And it is just left for me now to hand over to our host pastor, the Reverend Astor Carlisle, for the closing remarks and benediction.
Thank you, Earl. Friends, we thank you for having participated in this conversation. This particular international health matter warrants responsible information gathering, responsible information sharing, and continued dialogue so that responsible action can be taken. As part of the Church Universal, we commit to facilitating exchanges of this nature. On your behalf, I would like to express thanks to our panelists, Dr. Michelle Brown, for your concise yet clinical presentation on the COVID-19 virus, Dr. Karen Lewis Bell for joining us via Zoom for your cogent unpacking of the process of vaccine development and distribution, Dr. Ernestine Watson for your clear articulation of the immunization process, along with the benefits and the possible adverse effects of the COVID-19 vaccine. And of course, the Reverend Norbert Stevens for the call to conscience and consciousness regarding health, regarding hope, and regarding justice as it regards our pursuit of health and life. And of course, Mr. Earl Moxham for being a champion seafarer, helping us to navigate the waters and issues surrounding this very matter. I want to thank the technical team here at the Webster Memorial United Church, and of course, those who lead the advocacy team and all other members and friends joining us online this evening. We trust that your time with us was a meaningful one, and we ask that you share the YouTube clip with your friends and your family members, helping them to understand this matter a little bit more. Let us receive the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and grant you peace. In the name of